What if the person who hurt you the most isn't as emotionally untouchable as they appear? What if beneath the confidence, excuses, and cold silence lies something they spend every day trying to hide? The truth is, some people will protect their image at any cost, even if it means losing the people who once loved them. And understanding this could be the first step toward reclaiming your peace. One of the greatest mistakes people make after experiencing emotional manipulation is believing that the other person never thinks about what happened. They assume that because there was no apology, no accountability, and no visible regret, there must also be no inner conflict. But human behavior is often far more complicated than what appears on the surface. When a person has strong narcissistic traits, protecting their self-image can become one of the most powerful forces driving their behavior. They build an identity around appearing right, strong, admired, or superior. That carefully constructed image becomes something they feel they must defend at all costs. Admitting that they deeply hurt someone can feel like a threat to that identity. So instead of accepting responsibility, they may deny, justify, minimize, or redirect the blame. This does not mean you should assume you know exactly what they secretly feel. Every person is different, and we cannot know another person's private emotions with certainty. What we can observe is a common pattern. When acknowledging harm would damage the image someone is determined to protect, they often choose self-protection over accountability. This is why sincere apologies can become so rare. Instead of saying, "I was wrong," they may say, "You misunderstood." Instead of recognizing your pain, they may focus on your reaction. Instead of asking how they affected you, they begin explaining why their behavior was necessary or why someone else was responsible. The conversation quietly shifts away from healing and toward preserving their version of themselves. For the person on the receiving end, this can be deeply confusing. You replay conversations in your mind. You wonder whether you were too sensitive. You question your memory. You search for one sentence that finally proves your experience mattered. But the more you chase validation from someone committed to protecting their image, the more exhausted you become. That is because you are asking for something they may not be emotionally prepared to give. Many people believe confidence means never admitting mistakes. Real confidence is the opposite. Emotionally mature people understand that taking responsibility does not destroy their character. It strengthens it. They recognize that saying, "I was wrong," is not a sign of weakness but a sign of integrity. Accepting responsibility allows trust to grow because honesty replaces defensiveness. Someone who constantly protects their image may never experience that freedom. Every disagreement becomes a battle to be right. Every criticism becomes a personal attack. Every difficult conversation becomes an opportunity to defend themselves rather than understand another person. Over time, this creates emotional distance. Relationships become built on appearances instead of authenticity. Conversations become performances instead of honest exchanges. The image survives, but the connection slowly disappears. If you have lived through this, you may have spent years believing that their refusal to apologize meant your pain was insignificant. It did not. Another person's inability to acknowledge your experience is not evidence that your experience was unimportant. It is often evidence that accountability feels too threatening to the identity they are trying to preserve. This realization changes everything. You stop measuring your worth by the apology that never came. You stop waiting for someone else's words to confirm what you already lived through. You begin trusting your own observations instead of endlessly debating them inside your mind. That does not mean becoming bitter. It means becoming clear. You no longer waste energy trying to force awareness into someone who continues choosing self-protection. Instead, you redirect that energy toward rebuilding your own confidence, strengthening your emotional boundaries, and surrounding yourself with people whose character allows honesty to exist Because healthy relationships are not built on perfection. They are built on accountability, humility, and the courage to admit when we have caused pain. And those qualities can never grow where protecting an image matters more than protecting the people who trusted it. Because the person who fears admitting the truth often becomes a prisoner of the image they refuse to let go of. One of the most painful experiences after an emotionally unhealthy relationship is realizing that the events you lived through are being described very differently by the other person. The conversations you remember clearly are suddenly denied. Promises that were once made seem to have disappeared. Hurtful words become things that never happened, and your emotional pain is dismissed as an exaggeration. Slowly, you begin questioning something you once trusted without hesitation, your own memory. This is why protecting your sense of reality becomes so important. When someone is unwilling to accept responsibility for their behavior, they may begin reshaping the story in ways that protect their self-image. Instead of honestly reflecting on what happened, they create explanations that place them in a more favorable position. Sometimes they minimize the damage, sometimes they justify it, sometimes they shift the blame entirely. Whatever form it takes, the result is often the same. They move further away from accountability while leaving you carrying the emotional weight. This can become deeply confusing. You replay old conversations, searching for certainty. You wonder whether you misunderstood what was said. You question whether your feelings were reasonable. You begin asking yourself questions that never existed before. Was I expecting too much? Did I imagine those moments? Am I remembering it incorrectly? Over time, constant self-doubt becomes more exhausting than the original conflict. This is why emotionally manipulative dynamics can leave lasting emotional scars. The goal is not always to win an argument. Sometimes the outcome is that you no longer trust your own judgment. And once that confidence begins disappearing, it becomes much easier for another person's version of reality to replace your own. Healthy relationships work differently. When misunderstandings happen, both people remain open to honest conversation. They may remember details differently, but neither person is trying to erase the other's experience. There is room for accountability, empathy, and mutual understanding. The goal is not to protect an image, but to protect the relationship. When accountability disappears, however, every conversation becomes a courtroom instead of a place for healing. Facts become flexible. Responsibility becomes negotiable. Truth becomes whatever best protects the person's reputation. That is why chasing endless explanations rarely brings peace. You may believe that if you simply present enough evidence, choose better words, or explain your feelings one more time, everything will finally make sense. But when someone is committed to defending their image instead of examining their behavior, no amount of explanation can create the honesty they are unwilling to practice. This is the moment where healing quietly begins, not when the other person finally admits everything, but when you stop making your emotional stability depend on their agreement. You begin trusting your own observations again. You remember that your feelings deserve consideration, even if someone refuses to validate them. You stop measuring reality by another person's approval and start measuring it by consistency, honesty, and lived experience. This does not mean refusing to reflect on your own mistakes. Self-reflection is healthy. Humility is healthy. Personal growth requires both. But there is an important difference between taking responsibility for your actions and accepting responsibility for someone else's choices. One helps you grow. The other keeps you trapped in guilt that was never yours to carry. As your confidence slowly returns, you no longer feel compelled to argue over every version of the past. You understand that some people will continue protecting the story that allows them to avoid accountability. You cannot control that decision. What you can control is whether you continue surrendering your peace to it. Your greatest strength is not proving that your memories are perfect. It is refusing to abandon your own reality simply because someone else refuses to acknowledge it. Because the moment you stop seeking permission to trust your own experience is the moment you begin reclaiming your freedom. One of the most powerful moments in your healing journey does not happen when the other person changes. It happens when you do. For a long time, you may have believed that peace would only come after receiving an apology, hearing an admission of wrongdoing, or finally being understood. But real transformation begins the moment your emotional well-being is no longer tied to someone else's willingness to acknowledge your pain. In emotionally unhealthy relationships, control is rarely maintained through force alone. More often, it is sustained through emotional dependence. You begin looking to the other person for validation, reassurance, or permission to feel worthy. Their approval determines your confidence. Their attention determines your mood. Their silence determines your anxiety. Without realizing it, your emotional center slowly moves from within yourself to someone else's opinion. This is why healing can feel so unfamiliar at first. The moment you stop chasing explanations, stop defending your reality, and stop trying to earn the understanding that never comes, an empty space appears. At first, that space feels uncomfortable because you spent so long filling it with worry, overthinking, and emotional negotiation. But with time, that same space becomes freedom. Instead of wondering what they think about you, you begin asking what you think about yourself. Instead of waiting for their validation, you begin building your own confidence through your actions. Instead of measuring your value by their treatment, you begin measuring it by your character, your integrity, and the life you are creating. That quiet shift changes everything. When you continue growing despite the pain, you reclaim something that was never meant to belong to another person. Your identity. You remember the dreams you placed on hold. You reconnect with friendships you neglected. You return to hobbies, ambitions, and passions that slowly disappeared while you were trying to fix a relationship that could not be healed by effort alone. Your energy no longer revolves around surviving emotional uncertainty. It begins fueling personal growth. This is why rebuilding your life is so important. The more complete your own life becomes, the less power unhealthy relationships have over your emotions. You stop seeing yourself only through the lens of what happened to you. Instead, you begin seeing yourself through the possibilities that still lie ahead. There is another important truth. When someone who once had a great deal of emotional influence over you realizes that you are no longer seeking their approval, the dynamic changes. The patterns that once kept you emotionally attached become less effective because you are no longer responding in the same way. You are no longer arguing to be understood. You are no longer chasing conversations that leave you feeling smaller. You are no longer sacrificing your peace in exchange for temporary moments of reassurance. This is not about making another person react. It is about changing your own life. Your healing is not a performance meant to prove something. It is a commitment to yourself. Whether another person notices your growth or not becomes increasingly unimportant because your motivation no longer comes from their attention. It comes from your desire to become emotionally healthier, wiser, and stronger. The most remarkable part of this journey is that peace arrives quietly. It does not always come through dramatic endings or perfect closure. Sometimes it arrives when you wake up one morning and realize you no longer spend every hour replaying the past. You no longer need someone else's explanation to move forward. You no longer feel trapped by memories that once controlled your thoughts. That is real freedom. It is the freedom to invest your time in your future instead of your wounds, your purpose instead of your pain, and your growth instead of someone else's choices. Because every step you take toward rebuilding yourself weakens the influence that unhealthy relationship once had over your life. Because the moment you stop searching for your worth in someone else's approval is the moment you finally discover it within yourself. One of the greatest shifts in your life begins the moment you realize that not every battle deserves your participation. For a long time, you may have believed that if you explained yourself one more time, defended your intentions more clearly, or found the perfect words, the other person would finally understand. You hoped that honesty would replace misunderstanding, that patience would soften resistance, and that love would overcome manipulation. But some conversations are never searching for understanding. They are searching for control. When someone repeatedly twists your words, ignores your feelings, or turns every disagreement into an argument about your character, the issue is no longer communication. The issue is the pattern. Every explanation you give becomes another opportunity for your words to be challenged. Every emotional reaction becomes another source of energy for a cycle that never truly changes. This is why silence can become so powerful. Silence is often misunderstood. Many people believe silence is a punishment or a way to make someone feel guilty. But healthy silence has nothing to do with revenge. It is the decision to stop feeding a pattern that repeatedly steals your peace. It is choosing not to participate in conversations that exist only to confuse, exhaust, or control you. There is strength in recognizing when words are no longer creating understanding. Imagine trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. No matter how much water you pour into it, it never becomes full. Eventually, you realize the problem is not the amount of water. The problem is the bucket itself. In the same way, endless explanations cannot repair a conversation where honesty is continually replaced by defensiveness or manipulation. Many people fear emotional detachment because they confuse it with becoming cold. But emotional detachment is not the absence of compassion. It is the presence of wisdom. It means caring about your own emotional well-being enough to stop allowing every criticism, accusation, or emotional outburst to determine your state of mind. It means recognizing that another person's emotions belong to them, just as yours belong to you. This does not mean you stop being kind. It means you stop sacrificing your inner peace in the hope of changing someone who has shown no willingness to change themselves. One of the most difficult habits to break is the need to defend yourself against every false accusation. You want the truth to be known. You want your intentions to be understood. You want fairness. Those desires are natural. But there comes a point where constantly defending yourself becomes emotionally exhausting because the other person has already decided what they want to believe. You cannot force openness into a closed mind. You cannot create accountability for someone who consistently avoids it. And you cannot heal a relationship by carrying all of its emotional weight alone. This is where emotional boundaries become essential. Boundaries are not acts of anger. They are acts of self-respect. They remind you that your time, your attention, and your emotional energy are valuable. They teach you that protecting your peace is not selfish. It is necessary. Every healthy boundary quietly says, I refuse to participate in patterns that repeatedly harm my well-being. As you begin practicing this, something remarkable happens. The emotional chaos that once controlled your days begins losing its influence. You stop waking up wondering how to fix another person's behavior. You stop spending sleepless nights preparing arguments that will never be heard fairly. Instead, you invest that energy in your own healing, your own purpose, and the relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. Peace returns gradually, not because the other person changes, but because you stop allowing their behavior to decide the quality of your life. That is real emotional freedom. It is not winning every argument. It is no longer needing to, because the greatest power you can reclaim is the power to protect your peace without needing anyone else's permission. After spending so much time trying to understand another person's behavior, there comes a moment when the most important question changes. Instead of asking, "Why did they treat me this way?" you begin asking, "Who am I becoming because of what happened?" That single question marks the beginning of real healing, because it shifts your attention away from someone else's choices and back toward your own future. One of the deepest wounds caused by emotionally unhealthy relationships is not simply the pain of betrayal or manipulation. It is the gradual loss of identity. Over time, you may have stopped trusting your instincts. You may have questioned your judgment, hidden your opinions, or abandoned parts of yourself just to avoid conflict. Without realizing it, you began living according to another person's emotional reactions instead of your own values. This happens so slowly that many people do not notice it until they finally step away. Only then do they realize how much of themselves they left behind. Perhaps you stopped pursuing goals that once excited you. Perhaps you drifted away from close friends and family. Perhaps you lost confidence in decisions that once felt natural. Every compromise seemed small on its own, but together they slowly reshaped the person you believed yourself to be. This is why rebuilding your identity must become your highest priority. Healing is not about becoming the person you were before the pain. It is about becoming someone even stronger because of what you have learned. You begin reconnecting with the qualities that always belonged to you. Your kindness, your resilience, your creativity, your courage, and your ability to love without losing yourself. That process requires patience. There will be days when old memories return. There will be moments when you question whether you are making progress. Healing is rarely a straight path. Some days feel light, while others remind you of wounds you thought had already disappeared. Do not mistake those difficult moments for failure. They are often signs that your mind is processing experiences it once had to suppress just to survive. Every small step matters. Each healthy boundary you maintain strengthens your self-respect. Each decision guided by your values rebuilds your confidence. Each moment you choose peace over chaos reminds you that your life no longer has to revolve around someone else's behavior. As your confidence grows, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop introducing yourself through your pain. You are no longer defined by the relationship that hurt you or the person who failed to appreciate you. Your story becomes larger than your suffering. Your experiences become lessons instead of lifelong identities. The past still exists, but it no longer controls the direction of your future. There is incredible freedom in reaching that point. You no longer need revenge to feel strong. You no longer need endless explanations to feel understood. You no longer need another person's approval to believe in your own worth. Instead, your confidence is built quietly through daily choices. You honor your commitments. You protect your peace. You surround yourself with people who respect your boundaries and celebrate your growth. Most importantly, you begin treating yourself with the same compassion you once gave so freely to everyone else. Remember, your identity was never meant to be built on another person's opinion of you. It was meant to be built on your character, your principles, and the choices you make every day. Those are things no one can take from you unless you willingly hand them over. So keep rebuilding, keep growing, keep choosing yourself. Not out of pride, but out of wisdom. Because the strongest version of you is not the one who never experienced pain. It is the one who refused to let pain become their permanent identity. Because the moment you reclaim who you are, you take back the one thing no unhealthy relationship should ever have the power to define: your life. As your journey continues, one final lesson becomes more important than every question you have asked along the way. You may still wonder whether they ever think about what happened. You may wonder whether they ever regret the pain they caused, or whether they will one day admit the truth. Those questions are understandable because every wounded heart longs for closure. We naturally hope that the person who caused the pain will one day recognize it and make things right. But healing cannot depend on a moment that may never come. Some people are capable of sincere reflection and accountability. Others may never openly acknowledge the harm they caused. We cannot know what another person privately feels or whether they experience regret, because those are inner experiences hidden from everyone else. What we do know is this: waiting for another person's confession or apology can keep your life emotionally tied to the very chapter you are trying to leave behind. Every day spent waiting for someone else to change is a day taken away from your own growth. There comes a moment when you must decide whether your future will be built around unanswered questions or around new possibilities. That decision is one of the most powerful acts of self-respect you will ever make. It does not erase the past, but it prevents the past from deciding who you become. Many people believe closure is something another person gives them. In reality, the deepest form of closure is often something you create for yourself. It begins when you stop measuring your healing by another person's actions. You no longer ask whether they finally understand your pain. Instead, you ask whether you are becoming more peaceful than you were yesterday. You stop chasing explanations and begin building a life that no longer depends on them. That shift is life-changing. Your mornings are no longer consumed by replaying old conversations. Your nights are no longer filled with imaginary arguments that never happened. Your energy gradually returns to the people who genuinely care about you, the dreams you postponed, and the future waiting patiently for your attention. This does not mean forgetting what happened. Wisdom remembers the lesson without carrying the emotional chains forever. You remember enough to protect your boundaries. You remember enough to recognize unhealthy patterns. But you refuse to let those memories become the center of your identity. There is extraordinary strength in reaching the point where another person's inability to take responsibility no longer controls your emotional state. Whether they apologize or remain silent, whether they reflect on the past or continue avoiding it, your direction remains the same. You continue growing, you continue learning, you continue choosing relationships built on honesty, mutual respect, and emotional maturity. That is not weakness, that is freedom. The greatest revenge is not making someone feel the pain they caused you. The greatest victory is building a life so full of purpose, peace, and self-respect that their choices no longer determine the quality of your days. Your happiness is no longer delayed until someone finally says the words you wanted to hear. It begins the moment you give yourself permission to move forward without them. Life becomes lighter when you stop carrying expectations that belong to someone else. You cannot control another person's willingness to change, but you can control your willingness to heal. That choice belongs entirely to you, and no one has the power to take it away. So let your future speak louder than your past. Let your character become stronger than your wounds. Let your peace become more valuable than your need for answers. Because the life waiting ahead of you deserves far more attention than the chapter that tried to convince you your story had already ended. Because true freedom begins the moment you stop waiting for someone else to unlock the door and realize you have held the key to your own peace all along.